I sat in my old Ford F-150, parked along Cherry Ridge Lane, where the streetlights hung like golden threads across the veil of a winter foam. Just 100 yards ahead, my son Ethan's two-story mansion glowed like a stage set. Laughter music, the clinking of glasses, all of it spilled through the cold air, tangled with the wind brushing the iron gate. Inside was Jacob's birthday party. My grandson. 8 years old today. He loved chocolate cake and toy trucks. I knew because I was the one who bought him his first back when his hands were still too small to hold it right. But tonight, I sat out here in the cold, listening to strangers laugh inside a house I built with my own hands. I pulled my hand from my coat pocket. The skin was cracked, my fingers trembling as I reached for the cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The condensation on the windshield caught the glow from the tall windows. Through it, I saw Ethan, dark suit, confident smile, shaking hands, laughing like he'd forgotten the smell of motor oil and dust that once defined his life. Beside him, Melissa, hair curled, wearing red, looked like she belonged in a world where people didn't have to remember how hard things used to be. Jacob darted past the window, holding a box bigger than he was grinning ear to ear. I wanted to wave. My hand lifted halfway before falling again, heavy as if a stone were tied to it. The old radio hummed to life. A tape, Grace's voice. My late wife. The recording was grainy, but her tone carried warmth, the kind that used to live in the corners of our home. If you ever find yourself lonely outside the house you built, remember the safe at Mountain Trust Bank. I closed my eyes. Every word landed slow and deliberate, like a hammer tapping against something hollow inside my chest. Grace always said things I only understood when it was already too late. She died in 2020. After that, the house wasn't a home anymore. And now it didn't even belong to me. Headlights cut through the fog, dragging me back. A dark SUV slowed to a stop beside me. A man in a guard's jacket stepped out, his breath visible in the cold, and knocked on the window. I rolled it down. The air hit like needles. "Evening, Mr. Rowe," he said softly. "Mr. Ethan asked me to check in. He's worried the neighbors might misunderstand if they see someone parked here too long." I looked at him. Young face. Polite eyes that couldn't meet mine. "I understand," I said. My voice came out low, rusted. "I'll be on my way." He nodded, hesitated. "It's a cold night. You should head home soon." I gave a faint smile. "I don't have a home nearby." His eyes flickered, guilt flashing across them like a spark. "I'm sorry, sir," he whispered before turning away. Through the rearview mirror, I watched the gate slide shut, light spilling and vanishing as the iron bars closed. I started the engine. The truck rumbled, old but steady, the sound of something that still had fight left in it. The last time I drove this truck up that driveway was 5 years ago, when Ethan asked me to clear out the garage. Said he'd renovate it. But the renovation turned into demolition, and what used to be my workshop became a storage space for his company. Now this truck was my roof, my shelter, my last piece of home. I drove south past the edge of town where the city lights thinned and the road cut through rows of abandoned warehouses. The parking lot behind them was quiet, a patchwork of cracked asphalt and weeds. I pulled in, killed the engine, and sat there listening. The wind moved through the gaps in the metal siding, making a sound like breathing. I climbed into the back, spread out an old blanket. The smell of oil and leather mixed with dust and time felt strangely comforting. Lying back, I looked up at the truck's ceiling. Small scratches marked the paint. Grace had told me to fix them once. "Leave it," I said. "When I have time." I never did. Not until I had nothing but time left. I remembered her hands smelling faintly of orange soap and soil from her garden. She used to tell me, "You fix cars for everyone else, Ben, but you never learned to fix yourself." I'd laughed back then. I don't laugh at that memory anymore. Outside, the wind picked up. I pulled the blanket tighter, glanced at the dashboard clock. 10:47. Inside Ethan's house, the music was probably fading. Guests getting ready to leave. Maybe they'd light candles, sing, cut the cake. Someone would ask, "Where's Grandpa?" And Melissa would smile politely and say, "He couldn't make it." I turned the radio back on. The tape whined, warped with age, but Grace's voice pushed through the static. "When you feel the cold," she said, "remember warmth doesn't always come from where you used to be." I smiled, just barely, though it faded fast. The kind of smile that ends before it even reaches your eyes. Through the windshield, I could still see the faint glow of the mansion across the ridge. In the mirror, I caught my own reflection, 64 years old, face-lined, hair gray at the edges. The part that hurt wasn't what time had done to me, but what I had let go along the way. The light from the house shimmered in my tired eyes, distant and unreachable. I exhaled slow. "I've rebuilt hundreds of engines," I whispered, voice low enough to disappear into the night. Every one of them had a chance if someone was patient enough. I just don't know if I've got enough time left to rebuild myself. I reached for the switch, turned off the cabin light. The hum of the engine quieted, leaving only the soft pulse of my breath fogging the glass. Out across the ridge, the house lights dimmed, shrinking into the mist, until there was nothing left but a thin streak of gold against the gray sky. The next morning, when the sun barely brushed the edge of the Rockies, the faint light hit the hood of my truck, glistening with dew. I was still in the driver's seat, neck-stiff, bones aching from the cold. Somewhere out in the gray distance, a bird cried out, once lonely and thin. Inside the cab, the air was heavy with the smell of old leather and oil, my kind of perfume. I blinked at the dashboard clock, twisted the key, and listened as the engine grumbled awake. Warm air began to crawl through the vents, slow and forgiving. I could still remember the smell of grease from 2010, when Rowe Auto and Restoration was the heartbeat of Englewood's South Side. The steel doors were chipped. The sign faded, but inside it was everything. Rows of Mustangs and old Chevy's engines that weighed more than I did, waiting for someone patient enough to bring them back to life. I worked 6 days a week, hands always black with oil. Every time I looked up, I'd see Grace standing at the doorway, holding a mug of coffee, smiling, the kind of smile that made the coldest days warm. "You forgot lunch again," she'd say softly. And right beside her was Ethan, barely 20, then trying to tighten his first bolt without stripping the thread. He was a marketing major back then, full of talk and curiosity. Said he wanted to learn how to do real work, not just write about it. So I let him into the shop. Showed him how to hold a wrench, how to tell which piston was stuck just by listening. Every time he broke something, and he broke plenty, I'd just laugh. I told him every mistake could be fixed if you were man enough to face it. He called me old man, and Grace called us her two oil-stained boys. Those were good years. The radio always played old country, the coffee always mixed with the smell of gasoline, and for a long while I believed my little family was as unshakable as the steel frames I welded together. But Ethan grew faster than I thought he would. After graduation, with his degree in one hand and ambition in the other, he came home talking about expansion, branding, investment clients, words that didn't sound like the clang of wrenches or the hum of engines. He said the garage could become a real company. I only half understood him, but the light in his eyes was so bright I couldn't dim it. He drew up a logo, built a website, and changed the name to Rowe and Partners Development. I asked why it needed partners. He said in the new world collaboration was everything. But deep down I knew he meant he wanted to step out of my shadow. Grace wasn't happy. One afternoon, sunlight came through the grimy shop window, landing on her hands as she walked toward me. I was under the lift, changing oil on an old Ford, when she said quietly that she didn't like the new name. "It still has Rowe," she said, "but it's lost its soul." I didn't say a word. I understood both of them. Ethan wanted to fly higher. Grace wanted to keep her feet where the ground still smelled like home. I thought time would make them understand each other. I was wrong. 2018 was the year everything changed. I was lifting a Mustang frame onto the stand when my back gave out. The sound. It was like something inside me snapped clean. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The doctor told me I shouldn't work anymore. Grace stayed by my side. Ethan visited every evening, telling me not to worry, that he'd take care of everything. I remember him sitting beside my bed, voice steady, confident. He said I should retire for good and let him put the house in his name just temporarily to make it easier for the business to get loans. I didn't question him. He was my son. Family doesn't need lawyers. So I signed. I didn't even read the fine print. After that, I stopped working much in the shop. I helped with the books, inspected the occasional car, but the place wasn't mine anymore. Ethan hired staff, changed the lights to bright white LEDs, put up a sleek new sign. He said he was modernizing. The old smell of grease faded, replaced by disinfectant and polish. Grace still brought coffee, but her eyes looked heavier each day. Then one evening I heard raised voices from the living room. Ethan stood in the center, holding a stack of documents. Grace stood opposite him, her voice trembling but sharp. "You're selling the garage?" she asked. "The one your father built." Ethan said it was just business, that the property was worth more than the rusted memories inside it. Grace shot back, "No one should forget where they started." Ethan's voice cut through hers. "You've been living in the past too long." That sound, the cold, hard edge of it, hit me harder than the pain in my spine. I stepped out of the hallway, ready to speak, but Grace's voice stopped me. She looked straight at him, and every word she spoke landed like a nail hammered into wood. "If you sell this place, you're not just selling land. You're selling your father's name. And your own." Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he said, quiet but sharp enough to slice the air, "I'm only doing what he taught me: fix what's broken, replace what's old." The front door slammed. The engine roared. Smoke rolled through the night. The smell of oil exhaust and years of my life tangled together until I couldn't breathe. Grace stood in the dark, her hands shaking. I put my hand on her shoulder. She said softly, "You've let him go too far, Ben." I had no answer. I thought he just needed time, that by morning he'd call, maybe apologize. But the next day the garage was silent. The air smelled like cold metal. Outside, a new sign leaned slightly on its post. 3 words I couldn't bring myself to say out loud: Rowe and Partners. That afternoon, I stood in the middle of the shop, sunlight catching the dust floating through the air. The clock ticked. The smell of burnt steel lingered. I knew the world I built had shifted just enough to never be the same again. The next day, Grace quietly gathered bills, receipts, and keys. She said she wanted to keep a few things safe. I didn't ask what she meant. The look in her eyes told me something had already broken, and this time it wasn't the machinery. Outside, the wind tore a tarp loose from a car frame. It flapped, caught air, and drifted into the sunset. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it in the corner. I told myself Ethan would understand someday. I looked down at my hands, scarred, stained, and trembling, and realized something simple and cruel. Once certain things slip through your fingers, no amount of work will ever bring them back. 2 years later, Grace was gone on a quiet autumn morning. so still it felt unreal. That day, the Denver sky was impossibly clear, washed in a thin gold light that laid itself across the porch. She had still been smiling the night before, teasing me to make the coffee weaker because her heart was racing too fast again. I didn't know it would be the last thing she'd ever say. When I woke, she was already still, her hand curled around a dish towel on the kitchen counter. The house, once full of the sound of her steps, had fallen completely silent. The funeral was small, just a handful of close friends. Martha brought white lilies. Evelyn Brooks, an old friend from Grace's volunteer days at the church, arrived late and held me so long I could hear her heartbeat. Ethan stood in a black suit and read the eulogy. His voice was steady, practiced. Not once did it break. But the words were wrong. He spoke of the Rowe and Partners' legacy and the values our family carries forward through our work. I stared at the ground. Grace never cared about legacies. She only ever cared about keeping a home standing. When it ended, Ethan put a hand on my shoulder and told me everything was taken care of. I nodded, but nothing about that day felt finished. After the funeral, the house seemed too large for one person. Even the clock ticked differently. I kept setting 2 coffee cups out by habit and staring at the one that stayed empty. At night, I left the hallway light on because I couldn't stand the dark. There was no garage to keep me busy anymore. Nothing left to fill the hours Grace once filled without trying. Bills still came in the mail. So did catalogs and letters addressed to both of us. But everything felt like it belonged to someone else. One afternoon, Ethan came by with a folder under his arm, talking fast, sharp, like a man pitching to investors. He said, "Dad, if we temporarily move the house title under my name, it'll make refinancing the new project easier." I didn't answer right away. He continued, "It's just paperwork. I'll handle it all." I looked at his face, those same eyes, only colder. The kind of cold that didn't come from distance, but from forgetting what warmth ever felt like. I signed. When the pen left the paper, something inside me let go. I thought I'd just helped him again. I didn't realize I'd signed myself out of my own home. The months that followed blurred together. Ethan rarely visited. Melissa sent polite emails reminding me to keep utility receipts for their accounting department. I didn't know which department she meant. I only knew that I wasn't needed anymore. One weekend, I drove to their new place in Cherry Hills to see Jacob. I pressed the intercom at the gate. A young woman I didn't recognize opened it slightly, speaking with rehearsed politeness. "Mr. Ethan is in a meeting with partners. It's not a good time for visitors." I told her I wasn't a visitor. I was his father. She froze, then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry, sir." He asked not to be disturbed. I stepped back, looked through the iron bars. Jacob was in the yard chasing a small dog across the grass. He spotted me, waved, his face bright as sunlight, but Melissa appeared and gently pulled him back inside. The gate slid shut with a mechanical hiss. The sound was clean, precise, final. The walk home felt longer than it should have. Every block seemed stretched. The houses looked too new, too smooth. Everything I'd built now belonged to people who needed an appointment to let me in. Inside my own house, I hung up my coat and sat down in the quiet. Grace's scent still lingered faintly in the curtains, the polished wood she used to wipe down every Saturday. Our wedding photo hung on the wall and the frame she'd sanded herself, its glass catching the late light. That night, I opened her closet. Everything inside was neatly folded, as if she'd just stepped out and might return to finish tidying. In the back corner sat a small oak box. Inside were old cards, a few keepsakes, and a tiny ring of keys tied with ribbon, along with a folded note. Her handwriting leaned slightly to the right, thin but steady even after all those years. Keys to the Mountain Trust safe. Open only when you need an answer. I turned the paper over, half expecting more, but that was it. I held it in my hand, the ink faded, but alive. Grace always had a way of turning ordinary things into mysteries. She never wasted gestures. If she left this, there was a reason. The keys clinked softly in my palm, silver flashes under the lamp. I didn't know what kind of answer she meant, or if I was ready for one. I folded the note again, slipped it into my wallet set, and kept it close. For weeks after I listened to the rain tapping on the roof, thinking about what I'd lost. The old garage was now the headquarters of Rowe and Partners. White walls, chrome signage, Ethan in a tailored coat shaking hands with men who never smelled of grease. I drove past once, watched from the curb, when another car passed its headlights reflected off the new sign, and I saw my name, our name warped across the windshield, stretching away like something that didn't belong to me anymore. One morning in September, I opened the fridge for milk and heard Grace's voice faint like a whisper caught in the air. I couldn't make out the words, but it froze me. The carton slipped from my hand, rolled across the floor. For a moment, I could almost feel her near, as if she'd been standing just out of sight. I opened my wallet, took out the folded paper, read the line again. Open only when you need an answer. I didn't yet know what the question was, but as I stared at our wedding photo, my fingers trembling on the glass, I realized something was coming. Something that would demand one. Early spring in Denver carried a kind of quiet chill, cold enough to sting, but bright and open in a way that made you believe the air itself could forgive things. I drove the old Ford F-150 down the sleepy rows of houses toward a narrow street where Martha Lee's cafe sat tucked beside a garden supply shop. The wooden sign out front had faded to a pale gold. A few geranium pots hung from the awning, swaying lightly in the wind. I parked behind the building and took a long breath. The scent of coffee and baked bread spread through the air, soft and steady, like a warm blanket laid across the morning. Martha was behind the counter when I stepped in, the bell above the door chiming once. She looked up. Her brown eyes flickered with surprise, then settled into a small, sad smile. I nodded, told her I'd have my usual black. She poured it slow, steadying the cup so the foam wouldn't spill, then leaned over the counter and asked in a quiet voice if I'd been all right. I wanted to say I was fine, but the words stuck. She already knew something. She said someone had seen my truck parked overnight near the old garage, that they were wondering why I wasn't at home. I told her I just needed quiet, that sometimes the places you know best no longer have room for you. She said nothing for a while, then slid a small plate toward me. A butter raisin cake. On the house, she said. I thanked her, but inside it stung. Pity always did. It felt like a pin pressing against the softest part of a bruise. Near the window, a young woman sat with a laptop open, typing in slow bursts. Her pale blue jacket caught the light. When Martha spoke, the woman's eyes lifted from the screen, careful, like she didn't want to miss a word. Once she caught me looking and smiled politely, the kind of smile strangers exchange when they both understand silence better than talk. I nodded back and turned to my cup. A few minutes later, Martha pulled out a chair and sat across from me. She told me a neighbor had mentioned seeing the Rowe and Partners logo on a billboard out near Parker, that Ethan's face was on it, alongside some developer, that people were calling him one of the city's rising names. I thought I'd feel proud hearing it. Instead, my chest went tight, heavy as cooled steel. Martha studied my hands and said softly that I should visit Jacob more often. The woman by the window closed her laptop and walked over. She introduced herself as Lisa Andrews, a writer for a city paper. Her tone was respectful, careful, like she was approaching something fragile. She said she'd overheard a bit of the conversation and asked if she could join. I hesitated, then nodded. Lisa said she was working on a series about families in times of change, stories that didn't always make it to the financial pages. She asked a few short questions. I told her I used to run a garage, that I loved fixing things, that my son was quicker and smarter than I ever was. She asked to take a photo only if I agreed. I said yes. She said she'd post it on her personal blog first just to test the response. I straightened up, set my coffee beside a folded napkin. She stepped back, framed the shot, and pressed the shutter. One click. Then she smiled and said the light was good, that the picture said what it needed to say. "It's about what a home means," she said. When she returned to her seat, Martha reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on mine. She offered to call Ethan for me. I told her no. If a door needs someone else to knock, I said, then maybe the person inside isn't ready to open it. Her eyes shimmered, and she withdrew her hand, heading back to the counter, just as the lunchtime orders began to pick up. I sat there longer than I planned, watching people come and go, listening to the grinder's hum, the laughter of a child near the back. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of Lisa's laptop screen. A draft headline sat there in bold gray letters. "A father sleeps in his truck outside his son's mansion." My chest tightened, but I didn't object. Some truths need to be written before anyone dares look at them. I only asked her not to publish the address or anything that could hurt Jacob. She nodded. She already understood. Around noon, I left the cafe and drove toward the industrial district. I parked in the lot where I sometimes spent the night, when the house felt too empty to bear. I dozed for a while. When I woke, the phone buzzed. A message from Lisa, a link. Her article was live. The photo filled the screen, me sitting by the window, steam rising from my cup, the world outside blurred with mist. Her words were simple, quiet. Not pitying. Not loud. Just true. Beneath it, the first few comments appeared, people asking why a father would be left sitting outside his own home, asking how they could help. I turned the screen off, leaned back, and closed my eyes. For a moment I could hear old sounds again, Grace calling from the porch, Ethan laughing when he caught his first bolt thread, right the hum of a good engine. The past and the present folded together, then dissolved into silence. 2 days later, Martha called. Her voice carried both excitement and disbelief. The Denver Chronicle had reached out to buy Lisa's story. I told her I didn't like being someone else's headline, but maybe some stories needed to breathe before they died in the dark. I only asked her to remind Lisa, protect Jacob. She said Lisa already promised. That night I found myself driving through Cherry Hills again. The lights in Ethan's house were softer than usual, no music, no party. I parked farther down the road, engine idling for warmth. My phone buzzed. Ethan's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. His voice came fast, cold. He said I was embarrassing him, that clients were calling, that people wanted to know why his father was sleeping in a truck. "What do you want, Dad?" "Money, what?" I stared at the windshield, fogged with breath, and told him I didn't want money. I just wanted him to remember what his mother taught us, that there are things no contract can buy and no ad campaign can fix. There was a pause so short it felt like the air stopped moving. Then came the faint crackle of a fireplace, his breath unsteady through the speaker. "You're ruining everything I built," he said quietly. And then the line went dead. The screen went black, his name disappearing like a light switched off too quickly. I lowered the window, let the cold come in until it stung. A folded paper slipped from the bag on the seat beside me, the newspaper Martha had tucked in earlier. The Denver Chronicle. In the center spread was the photo, me with the coffee, the window blurred with condensation, the old Ford reflected faintly outside. The cup sat on the page, now steam rising in a thin white thread that curled across my printed face. In the thick quiet of that night, I could hear my heartbeat again, steady, patient, like the sound of an old engine turning over after too long in the cold. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Denver was still cold, the kind of sharp chill that made the air feel brittle, but something in me pushed to get out of the truck before the city stirred. The newspaper still lay on the passenger seat, the corner of the page with my photo bent upward by the night wind. I folded it carefully, slid it into the glove box, then took out my wallet. Grace's note was still there, soft and worn at the edges, her slanted handwriting as alive as her voice had once been. I brushed my thumb against the small ring of keys attached to it, the ones I had carried for years and never used. Something told me this was the morning I had to. Mountain Trust Bank sat on Broadway, a gray stone building with a copper roof that caught the sun like an old penny. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me, the smell of polished wood, faint coffee drifting from the lobby kiosk. I had been here before long ago when Grace opened Jacob's first savings account. The layout hadn't changed. Neither had the man behind the service counter. Ben Rowe, said Frank Delgado, stepping out from behind his desk, his smile wide and sincere, the kind of expression banks rarely made room for anymore. His hair had turned more silver than salt now, but the kindness was the same. I shook his hand, told him I was here because of Grace. His face softened instantly. She told me this day might come, he said quietly. Said that if you ever showed up asking, I'd know what to do. He led me to a small room in the back. It smelled faintly of varnish and thyme. The overhead light was warm, the kind that made shadows feel respectful. Frank opened a narrow safe along the wall, reached inside and pulled out a sealed brown envelope, thick, heavy, the edges crisp despite the years. On the front, written in Grace's hand, were the words, "To be opened only at Ben Rowe's request." He set it on the table in front of me. "She left this 5 years ago," he said. "Strict instruction, it only goes to you and only if you ask for it yourself." I haven't so much as touched the seal. My throat tightened. I nodded but couldn't speak. When he left the room, the silence filled in around me like water. I sat still, listening to the slow ticking of the wall clock, the steady rhythm of something that had waited long enough. Then I picked up the envelope, took a breath, and broke the seal. Inside were 2 items, a folded letter in Grace's handwriting, and a bundle of legal papers stamped by an old notary office. I unfolded the letter first. The opening line stopped me cold. "My dear Ben, if you're reading this, it means Ethan has gone too far down the road he believes is right." I breathed in deep, the kind of breath you take before pain. Inside this envelope is the original transfer document for the house. The one you signed was only a copy, never filed, never recorded. If Ethan ever forgets what honesty means, bring these papers to Evelyn Brooks. She'll know what to do. I closed my eyes. Evelyn Brooks. Grace's closest friend from their volunteer days, was now one of Denver's best estate attorneys. I remembered her at the funeral. The way she squeezed my hand told me that if anything ever felt wrong, I should call her. I hadn't. Until now. I unfolded the legal file. My name was there first, then Grace's, then Ethan's, listed as a temporary manager of the property, with a line below stating effective upon lawful registration with the Arapahoe County Land Office. On the back, the space for the official signature was blank. No seal, no witness. The paper had never been filed. Legally, the house still belonged to me. For a moment, I just sat there, my pulse loud in my ears. Light filtered through the glass panel in the door, falling across the open envelope like a quiet spotlight. I could almost feel Grace's presence hovering in that strip of light, calm, patient. I read the last lines of her letter slowly. The house will know who deserves to stay. Don't let it become a place built on lies. I read that sentence 3 times, tracing the ink with my finger. Grace always wrote in a way that carried more than words. It carried the sound of truth you didn't want to hear. The paper trembled in my hand. It felt warm, as if her touch hadn't fully left it. Images came flooding back, Grace walking into the garage with coffee in hand, the way she'd sit up waiting while I worked late, the rhythm of her voice when she talked about Ethan's future. She had believed in him more than anyone, and somehow she'd still prepared for this. A knock on the door startled me. Frank stepped back in, asking gently if I needed any copies or help securing the documents. I told him no, that I needed to keep them close. He looked at the opened envelope, then at me, surprise flickering behind his eyes, but no questions following. She planned everything, he said softly. Even for the things we never want to plan for. I stood, shook his hand longer than was polite, but he didn't pull away. He wished me luck and led me back through the lobby, past the soft hum of morning traffic and the quiet clatter of keys behind the counter. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, and the frost along the curb was melting into small, gleaming streams. I walked slowly to the truck, opened the door, and set the envelope on the passenger seat. For a while, I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what I'd found. It was like unlocking a door that couldn't be shut again. I thought about Ethan, the last time he'd looked at me and somehow not seen me at all. Grace had been right. Some silences are not mercy. Some are surrender. I turned the key. The engine shuddered, then steadied into its familiar hum. My hand rested on the envelope, my thumb tracing the faint blue stamp of the notary seal. Sunlight spilled through the windshield, cutting across my face. In the reflection, my eyes looked different. Not tired, not lost, just clear. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where I was headed. Morning broke gray over Denver, the kind of cold that made light itself move slower. The highway shimmered in a pale haze, a river of steel catching sun. I drove with both hands on the wheel, the envelope inside my jacket, pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. Every few miles I caught myself touching it, half to make sure it was still there, half to remind myself that what it held was real. Downtown rose ahead, towers catching the early light like mirrors turned toward heaven. I exited onto 17th, found the garage beneath the high-rise that bore Evelyn Brooks's name on its directory, and parked among rows of polished cars that looked cleaner than most people's lives. Inside, the lobby smelled of marble and money. Light bounced from glass to glass until it hurt the eyes. When I said Evelyn's name, the receptionist smiled, the kind of smile meant to hold you in place, then sent me up. Her office looked west toward the Rockies, where snow still held the peaks like smoke that never lifted. Evelyn came out from the adjoining room with a folder tucked under her arm. Her hair had turned silver in streaks. Her voice still carried that quiet precision Grace used to trust. She smiled and offered her hand. I set Grace's envelope on the desk and told her everything from the letter to the hidden documents to the years I'd lived thinking the house no longer had my name on it. Evelyn didn't interrupt. Her eyes moved slowly across the pages as if she could hear Grace's voice between the lines. When she reached the end, she stopped, her finger resting on the empty notary field. "Ben," she said softly, "this deed was never recorded. In the eyes of the county, you're still the legal owner. Ethan's authority existed only in intention. He's never had the right to mortgage or transfer anything." For a long time, I couldn't speak. The weight I'd carried, all these years of loss, of guilt, shifted inside me, not gone, but rearranged. Evelyn folded her hands. "If you want," she said, "we can file a quiet title claim. It's a formal motion to confirm ownership when there's doubt or error in registration. Once the judge signs it, no one can contest it without your consent. The city glittered behind her glass wall, sunlight cutting across the rooftops, scattering between steel edges. I asked her quietly if that would take everything from Ethan. Evelyn looked down, her eyes softening. Sometimes, she said, a man has to lose something to understand what it really was. I told her I wasn't looking for revenge, only for the truth to stand where it once belonged. She smiled a tired human smile and jotted something on her pad. She made a call to the county clerk, her tone clipped and certain. When she hung up, she slid a few forms across the desk. I signed them, each stroke steady, each letter of my name landing clean. When it was done, Evelyn gathered the papers, placed them neatly into a document case, and handed me a copy. From this point forward, she said, it's in the court's hands, but as far as the law is concerned, you're back on solid ground. I thanked her, started to leave, but stopped at the door. Evelyn, I asked, what did Grace tell you when she left those papers? Her expression changed just slightly, like a curtain catching light. She said, Evelyn answered, if Ben ever forgets the worth of his own name, help him remember. The elevator hummed on the way down. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked older than I remembered, but less hollow. When the doors opened, the air hit me sharp, carrying exhaust and snowmelt. I was crossing the lobby when a voice sliced through the quiet. Dad. I turned. Ethan stood by the revolving doors, his black coat unbuttoned, eyes hidden behind sunglasses pushed to his head. The reflection of the glass building shimmered over his face, as if he'd become part of the facade itself. Are you trying to destroy my life? His voice was low but burning. You think this is about you and Mom's house. That place is a project now, a brand, a future for 50 employees. You're dragging us all down. I didn't answer right away. His anger wasn't new, it was inherited the same way his jawline was mine. I looked him straight in the eye. You did that yourself when you forgot what your mother taught you. He laughed short and sharp, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. You don't get it. This isn't just property, Dad. It's the company, the investors, everything I've built. I shook my head. What you've built isn't the problem. What you've built it on is. He took a step closer, voice dropping, trembling between rage and desperation. I can make this right. I'll buy you out. You'll live comfortably. No one ever has to know. I looked down at his hand, steady, manicured, the same hand that once trembled when I taught him to tighten his first bolt. Now it reached out, not for guidance, but to negotiate. I said no. For a second, something in his face cracked. Then the wall came back. He turned and walked off, his footsteps striking the marble like a metronome. The glass doors slid shut behind him, cutting the sound off mid-beat. Outside, the wind from the South Platte carried a clean, metallic chill. I stood there a moment, the city rushing around me, the file still in my hand. The light from the high-rises fractured on the windshield of my truck, bright and blinding. I climbed in, closed the door, and sat still. The air inside smelled faintly of oil and sun-warmed leather. I pulled out my phone. Grace's picture appeared on the screen. She was standing in the lavender field, holding her tea, smiling at something behind the camera. The reflection from the office tower slid across her face on the glass, a moving shimmer like breath. I set the phone on the dashboard and just watched. Outside, the traffic pulsed and roared. Inside, the only sound was the soft, steady rhythm of the engine beneath my hand, alive, patient, ready. And for the first time in years, I felt the road ahead wasn't taking me away from something. It was leading me home. The first message arrived Tuesday morning while I was parked near the old garage waiting for a call from Evelyn about the case filing. The notification lit up on my phone. Ethan Rowe steps down as CEO of Rowe and Partners Development. I read it twice, my eyes catching on the smaller print beneath. The decision followed an emergency meeting with major investors. No explanation. None was needed. I knew exactly what that meant. I turned off the screen and leaned back in my seat. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction. Only that deep, heavy ache of watching a machine break exactly the way you warned it would. That afternoon, Martha called. Her voice trembled as she said she'd seen the news and that my name had come up. I drove to the gas station nearby, the kind that always played the local news on a small TV mounted over the door. Ethan's face filled the screen, serious, polished. Then mine pulled from that old photograph in the Chronicle. A line of text crawled across the bottom. Sources suggest ongoing dispute between father and son over property ownership. I felt my chest tighten. My hand drifted to my jacket pocket, to the folded letter Grace had written, the paper worn soft, but somehow still sharp at the edges. The next day, a message came from Lisa. She wrote that Ethan had hired a crisis PR firm. Lawyers' statements planted stories. They were claiming I was losing my mind, that I'd fabricated everything to steal back what wasn't mine. She asked if I would meet her again. I told her to come that afternoon, at the garage, where it had all begun. The sky turned gray before noon, and by the time she arrived, rain had begun, a fine, steady drizzle. Her silver SUV pulled up beside the bay door, headlights cutting through the mist. She carried her small camera in one hand, a paper cup in the other. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with oil and wet steel. I wiped down a chair for her. She set up the tripod, quietly adjusting the lens without looking at me. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" She asked, something to make clear. I thought for a long time before answering. "No defense," I said. "Just the truth. And maybe a reminder of what Grace believed." She nodded once and turned on the camera. The small red light came on, painting a faint reflection across the hood of the old truck behind me. I spoke slowly. I said that this garage had once been a place where broken things found their way back. That family wasn't any different. That I didn't want the house or a name in print, only the truth standing where it should. Lisa didn't interrupt. When I finished, she turned the camera off and said quietly, "This won't be a story about a dispute. It'll be about what built one." 3 days later, it ran. The garage that built a family. The cover photo showed me sitting on a stool outside the garage, the Ford F-150 behind me, the morning fog softening everything it touched. Lisa's writing was gentle, deliberate, each sentence breathing on its own. She told how Grace and I built the place from nothing, how we raised a son there who learned to turn wrenches before he learned to lie, and how that same son turned a garage into a company, but lost the foundation that made it mean something. She ended with my words, "I don't need anything except the truth." The story spread faster than I expected. Hundreds of comments poured in. People wrote about their fathers, about the smell of motor oil in summer, about things they never said out loud. Some said they wished they'd apologized before it was too late. I read them all. I didn't feel joy or pity. But somewhere deep inside, something warm began to move again, slow, quiet, alive. That night, Ethan called. His voice was raw. He said the piece had cost him the last of his investors, that they called him a risk, that everything he'd built was slipping. I told him I hadn't written a word, and that if the truth made anyone walk away, maybe they were never meant to stay. Silence. Then the click of disconnection. 2 nights later, the rain came harder. Martha called in panic. "He's at the garage," she said. "You should come." By the time I got there, the front window was shattered. Glass littered the floor, glinting red under the reflection of my taillights. The rain dripped through a gap in the roof, pooling around the feet of the man standing in the middle of it. Ethan. His hands were cut, streaked with blood and rain. Melissa stood near the door, holding Jacob close, her face pale, her eyes wide with something more like fear than anger. I stepped inside. The floor crunched beneath my boots. Ethan spun around. His eyes were wild, bright, wet. "You happy now?" he shouted. "You've got your garage back. You've got the city's sympathy, and I've got nothing." I wanted to answer, but then Jacob's voice came soft but clear. "Dad, why is Grandpa scared of you?" The room fell silent. Ethan froze. His head turned slowly toward his son, confusion flickering into shame. Melissa's arms tightened around the boy. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over. I said nothing. The only sound left was the rain hitting the metal roof, steady, endless, like the sound of time itself remembering. Ethan dropped his gaze. His shoulders shook once, twice, then stilled. No words. Just breath. I turned toward the door. Outside, the rain glimmered against the puddles, catching the red light from the truck. Each reflection spread and broke like tiny pieces of forgiveness trying to find form. Some houses don't need locks, I thought. They just need someone brave enough to walk back inside. I left them there in their silence, in their reckoning, and stepped into the night. Behind me, the rain kept falling. Slow, relentless. Washing away what couldn't be repaired and leaving behind what still could. The sky over Denver that morning was clear and bitterly cold. I woke before dawn and sat in the stillness of the truck, hands on the steering wheel, eyes unfocused on the glass that had frosted overnight. Beside me, the brown leather folder Evelyn had given me lay perfectly straight, its edges worn but exact. The courthouse waited a few miles east, and through the windshield, I could already see the crowd gathering, reporters, cameramen, people who had no stake in the truth, but wanted to catch a piece of it anyway. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. What I felt was heavier, deeper, a mix of exhaustion and resolve, the kind that comes only when you've run out of places to turn. Today wasn't just for me. It was for Grace. Evelyn met me at the courthouse steps. She wore a dark blue suit, her stride sharp, sure. The air around her carried a steadiness that kept me upright. "Room 204, she said quietly. "Judge Patricia Warren will preside." The courtroom was small, just a few rows of benches, polished wood, that smelled faintly of varnish and winter coats. Across the aisle, Ethan sat between two young attorneys. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed by nights without sleep. Melissa wasn't there. His shoulders looked smaller than I remembered, but his jaw was still set in that stubborn way that once made me proud, and now only hurt to look at. Evelyn opened the folder beside me. Her fingers moved with precision, sliding out two marked documents. When the bailiff called the room to order, we both stood. Judge Warren entered from the side door, tall silver hair, tied back, her presence quiet, but absolute. Her voice filled the room, low and resonant, as she read the case summary. When she invited the first statement, Evelyn rose. Her tone was even, deliberate, every word placed like a tool on a workbench. She explained that two versions of a property transfer had been filed, one original, handwritten by Grace Rowe, and one digital copy submitted later with signs of alteration. She presented both to the bench. Her hands did not shake. Only her eyes softened when she said Grace's name. Ethan's lawyer objected immediately. "A clerical error," he said. My client was unaware of any edits. Evelyn said nothing. Instead, she turned her laptop toward the judge. On the screen, a magnified image appeared, the signature blown up so large that even the smallest distortion was visible. The expert's recorded voice played through the speakers, calm and clinical, describing the irregular pixel grid along Grace's handwriting, the shift in baseline alignment, where someone had digitally moved her name. Silence thickened. Ethan lowered his head. His knuckles whitened. Judge Warren raised her hand for quiet. She flipped through the papers slowly, her eyes narrowing when she reached the final handwritten note on the original lid, only upon lawful registration. She looked up, fixing Ethan in her gaze. One document represents trust, she said, her voice like tempered glass. The other, betrayal. This court chooses justice. The room went still. My heartbeat slowed, heavy and even, until it was the only sound I could hear. Evelyn placed a steady hand on my arm, a small anchor pulling me back to the moment. I turned toward Ethan. His face was down, unreadable, the fight gone out of him. Above him, sunlight from the high window split into a thin white bar, falling across his shoulder like a blade of light. The judge continued. The court hereby affirms legal ownership to Mr. Benjamin Rowe. The entity known as Rowe and Partners Development will be suspended pending independent audit. All associated transactions are frozen until further review. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room once more. In cases like these, what's truly lost isn't money. It's trust. My fingers clenched, then released. It felt like turning a bolt that had rusted in place for years, stiff at first, then suddenly free. When the session ended, no one moved. The sound of the gavel lingered longer than it should have. Ethan stood slowly, avoiding my eyes, and walked out the side door. His steps were uneven, uncertain. When the door closed behind him, the silence deepened. Evelyn gathered the papers, tucked them neatly into her case, and handed me a copy of the ruling. Grace was right, she said softly. Things do find their way back to where they belong. I nodded. Words felt too small. Outside, the hallway blazed with sunlight through the tall glass panels. Reporters had already gathered near the front steps. The hum of voices rose as we approached the click of cameras and the sharp burst of flashes. I heard my name called again and again. Lisa stood near the front, microphone in hand. Our eyes met. She didn't speak, just lifted her camera slightly. I gave the smallest nod and kept walking. Every flash captured something, but I couldn't tell if it was vindication or just another story. The air outside was clean and cold, carrying the scent of wet grass and printer ink. I paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back once at the courthouse dome gleaming under the pale sun. In the glass facade, my reflection mixed with the crowds, a blur of faces, indistinct human. At the truck, I stopped again, drew one deep breath. No one ever tells you that justice has a smell, but that morning it did, of paper and steel, of wind and of something simple and unburdened. I got in, set the folder on the dashboard, and looked once more at the building behind me. Its windows caught the light until the whole thing seemed to burn gold. When the engine started, the sound filled the cab, steady, certain. I shifted into drive and eased into the street, the courthouse fading in the rear view. No cheers, no tears, just silence. And ahead of me, a single line of sunlight stretched across the road, the one Grace had left for me to follow home. The road along Orchard felt unfamiliar that morning, though I'd driven it half my life. Maybe it was the fog, or maybe it was time. The maples lining both sides stood stripped and black wet with rain. When I turned up the incline toward the estates, my heartbeat slowed, each thud measured, deliberate, like a man approaching a memory he wasn't sure he deserved to see again. The house emerged through a veil of mist, dark and hollow. The iron gate hung half open, the sign Rowe residence gone, only the rusted nail marks left behind. On the front steps sat Ethan, shirt, wrinkled hair, unkempt, a glass of watered-down whiskey in his hand. When my truck stopped, he flinched, then steadied himself. His eyes weren't hateful anymore, just tired. I stepped out. The air was sharp and wet. Rain dripped from the trees in slow, deliberate taps against the stone walkway, like the ticking of a clock running out of day. I stopped a few feet from him. The scent of whiskey drifted through the damp air, mixing with the earthy smell of soaked grass and decaying wood. Ethan set his glass down. His voice was hoarse, cracked around the edges. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to hold on to prove I wasn't living in your shadow. I studied him, not angry, not pitying, just the quiet ache of recognition. I lowered myself onto the opposite step. Rain seeped through my coat, cold but grounding. Do you remember I asked how we used to rebuild engines that everyone else gave up on? Some machines only need a new gear. Others have to be taken apart completely before they can start again. People aren't much different, Ethan. They can run again if they're willing to take themselves apart first. He let out a dry, uneven laugh. You make it sound easy. You didn't lose anything. I looked at him. I lost your mother. I lost this house. I lost you. Tell me that's not enough. The words hung between us, heavy and final. He lowered his head. His shoulders sagged. The rain grew harder, drumming against the roof and the hollow silence between us. I looked around the yard. Everything Grace had touched was breaking her flower pots. Cracked the porch chair, rotting at the legs, the swing Jacob loved dangling from a single torn rope. Do you know what hurts most? I said quietly. Not losing something. It's when the person you love is still here, but the trust is gone. I didn't take you to court because I wanted to win, son. I didn't because you can't legislate remorse. You have to find it yourself. Ethan lifted his gaze, eyes glassy with rain and confusion. I betrayed everything she believed in. I nodded slowly. And she believed you'd figure that out someday. A sound broke through the rain, small, quick footsteps from inside. Jacob burst out barefoot, jacket askew, hair soaked and clinging to his forehead. He ran straight to me and threw his arms around my waist. The smell of rain soap and childhood hit me like memory itself. Grandpa, he said, voice muffled against my coat. Are you staying? Dad said the house is yours now. My throat tightened. I crouched down, my hand trembling on his wet hair. I didn't come to take anything, Jacob. I just wanted to see if this place could still be home. He looked up, his eyes so much like Grace's held both sadness and light. I pulled him closer, feeling the rhythm of his breathing blend with the soft patter of the rain. Ethan stood motionless, watching. His lips pressed together, his face cracking under the weight of shame and something older grief he'd never learned to speak. Then a sound from inside, the faint click of a door, the low hum of a phone speaker. Melissa stood in the doorway, her hands shaking. The screen in her palm glowed. A woman's voice, soft but steady, spilled into the air. Grace. Her tone was clear, calm, the kind that once held a house together. If you ever forget what's right, Ethan, look at your father. The voice froze the air. Ethan's eyes widened. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the wet stone. Melissa covered her mouth, tears streaking down her cheeks. Jacob turned to his father, whispering, Dad, why are you afraid of Grandpa? Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the boy, then at me, his expression breaking open like a dam. His chest heaved, his breath came in shudders, I stepped closer and laid a hand on his shoulder. Your mother always said this house would choose who deserved to stay, I told him softly. Do you want to try again? He didn't speak. He just nodded a faint broken motion. The rain eased. Wind moved through the porch beams, sighing through the cracks of the house like an exhale long overdue. Then came a word, small, raw, nearly lost in the sound of the storm. Dad. It landed heavier than any sentence we'd ever exchanged. I closed my eyes and drew a slow breath. Something inside me loosened, an old ache uncoiling. I didn't hug him. I didn't need to. My hand stayed on his shoulder, firm but gentle. Between us was not forgiveness, not yet, but the open space where forgiveness could one day live. Inside, the faint recording of Grace's voice played once more, then faded into silence. Above, the clouds began to thin. A ribbon of pink light stretched across the western sky, touching the lavender field beyond the fence. The scent of wet soil mixed with the ghost of flowers long dead, but not gone. Ethan sank onto the porch step, burying his face in his hands. I stood beside him, watching the road ahead, where headlights blurred in the distance, their reflections rippling across puddles like fleeting memories. There was no triumph, no final peace, only quiet, and the fragile beginning of something that might one day heal. A father, a son, and a house that after all this time had finally found its soul again. The morning after the rain, Denver felt like it had been rinsed clean. The sky was a shade of blue so clear it almost looked borrowed from somewhere else, too bright, too precise, as if the city itself was trying to start over. I drove slowly toward the old garage, the one that had been both my livelihood and my hiding place for half my life. The tires rolled through shallow puddles that caught the light like small mirrors. When I pulled up, the building stood there as it always had. Rusted, stubborn, still breathing. The metal door screamed in protest as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with oil and silence. Dust covered everything in a soft gray film, the half-finished cars, the workbench, the crooked photos Grace once taped up. The space smelled like metal sweat and time. Each step I took echoed sharp, hollow, like waking something old that had been waiting. I started to clean, not out of necessity, but out of instinct, because touching the past sometimes hurts less than leaving it still. I lifted each piece one by one, a rusted pair of pliers, a bent wrench, the blue-silver toolbox Grace painted herself. She said the color made the room less lonely at night. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of worn paper towels, I found a folded piece of paper. The edges were soft, the crease delicate. I unfolded it slowly, knowing before I even saw it whose handwriting it was. Grace's letters, angled, feminine, certain. The ink had faded, but the words still breathed. A house isn't made of brick and wood. It's made of the places where hearts learn to forgive. I sank into the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. Light from the window fell across the words, illuminating them like they'd been written for this very moment. I could almost hear her voice again, soft but steady, the same tone she used when bringing me coffee during late nights in the shop. Forgiveness isn't weakness, Ben. It's a kind of strength that only arrives after you've lost enough to understand what it costs. The sound of tires outside pulled me back. I turned as Evelyn stepped through the doorway, a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. Her navy suit was the same as always, but her expression was lighter, her eyes kinder. She looked around, breathing in deeply. "It smells like the past in here," she said quietly, the good kind. I poured 2 cups of coffee from the dented old pot I still used every morning. The aroma mixed with the faint scent of grease and dust. Evelyn set the folder down. Embossed across it in clean gray letters were the words, The Grace Rowe Foundation. She told me that after the court case, a group of Grace's old colleagues and donors had created a foundation in her name to help veterans and young people learn automotive restoration. They wanted me to oversee the training program. Right here in this garage. I didn't answer right away. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, glinting off the steel beams, the same ones I'd welded decades ago with hands that used to be steady. Grace would have liked that, I said. Evelyn smiled, eyes shining. She didn't just like it. She planned it. She said, if you ever forgot why you started, this place would remind you. I picked up the pen and without thinking twice signed my name. The ink bled slightly into the paper. Evelyn exhaled softly, stood, and lingered at the door. For the first time in a long while, she said, this place feels like it can breathe again. By afternoon, the first group arrived. 5 kids, 3 boys, 2 girls, 18, maybe 20, their eyes bright but unsure. Alongside them was George, a veteran in his 50s with steady hands and the posture of a man who's seen both war and repair. The air shifted when they walked in. The smell of oil and youth mixed into something alive. I began simply with no notes and no speeches, just motion, rhythm, sound. I showed them how to pull a filter, how to check a spark plug, how to feel an engine through the vibrations of the metal rather than the numbers on a gauge. Their hands were clumsy at first, but they learned fast. One of the girls looked up from the engine and asked, "Why'd you keep this old truck instead of getting a new one?" I smiled, wiping my hands on a rag. "Because this truck's been through everything I have. It reminds me that nothing's ever truly broken if you still have the patience to start again." When the last bolt was tightened, I handed the youngest boy the key. "Go ahead," I said. He turned it. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught a low, warm growl that filled the garage. The sound rolled through the air like a heartbeat, rediscovering its rhythm. The kids laughed. The dust floated upward, glowing gold in the light. I stepped back. My palms were still black with oil. And in the haze of sunlight and dust, I saw her, or thought I did. Grace standing there in the doorway, arms folded, smiling, that quiet, knowing smile. No words, just presence, just peace. Later, when the students had gone, I sat alone on the front step. The truck was still idling, its engine humming like a lullaby from another life. Outside, wind swept through the lavender bushes I'd replanted last spring. Their scent drifted into the garage, mingling with the warmth of the motor. On the far wall, Grace's photo hung in its old oak frame. The light hit it just right, catching her eyes, making them shimmer with life. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to the hum of the engine, to the rustle of the wind, to the quiet proof that life somehow was still moving forward. When I finally stood, I pulled the note from my pocket and placed it on the workbench beside a polished wrench. The paper trembled faintly in the lamplight. A house isn't made of brick and wood. It's made of the places where hearts learn to forgive. I read it again and again until the words sank into me like breath. Then I folded it, slipped it back into my jacket, and felt it rest against my chest, like carrying the pulse of this place itself. Outside, dusk was bleeding into red. Sunlight spilled across the gravel lot, striking the side of the F-150, bouncing upward to paint the ceiling in moving streaks of gold. I could hear the soft creak of metal cooling the sigh of the wind slipping through the open door. And somewhere between the hum of that old engine and the lavender-sweet air, I heard her again, Grace laughing quietly, the sound fading into the night. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man searching for a home. I was already there. Not in walls or roofs, but in the stillness she left behind, in forgiveness, in memory, and in the gentle mercy of finally forgiving myself. Summer came quietly to Denver, settling over the city like a soft, golden film. The streets shimmered under long hours of light. Maple trees burst into new leaves, and the air smelled faintly of metal and sun-warmed pavement. At the garage, the days began with the familiar hiss of the coffee pot and ended with laughter, young voices rising above the hum of engines. My old Ford F-150 sat gleaming in its corner, a silent witness to all that had been lost and somehow rebuilt. Life had steadied into something that felt almost peaceful. Yet sometimes when I turned toward Cherry Hills, where the house still stood among the trees, quiet and distant, I felt a small tug, a whisper, that Grace wasn't quite finished with me. That evening I called Evelyn. We met at the cafe by the window, the same table where Grace once liked to read her newspaper. The air inside was heavy with the smell of roasted beans and old wood. I told her what I'd been thinking, that I wanted to give the house to the foundation, to turn it into a shelter for veterans and families who had nowhere else to go. Evelyn watched me for a long moment. The streetlights outside flickered on, bathing her face in amber. Grace would be proud, she said softly. But are you sure, Ben, that house has been a part of your life for decades? I looked out the window, watching the late light stretch across the street. It used to be my home, I said. Now it should belong to more people than just me. A week later, the paperwork was ready. We sat around the long oak table at the foundation office, Evelyn, the board members, and to my quiet surprise, Ethan and Melissa. They signed the documents beside me, their hands trembling slightly. I could see it in their eyes, gratitude, guilt, something that lived between apology and acceptance. Ethan spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. You could have kept everything, Dad, but you chose to forgive us instead. I'll never forget that. I rested my hand on his shoulder. It felt like setting down the last weight I'd been carrying for years. Melissa stood beside him, eyes red, voice unsteady. I want to volunteer at the foundation, she said. Help with the children's program. I want to do something that matters. I nodded. Grace would have smiled hearing that. When the day of the dedication arrived, the house looked nothing like it once had. The walls were freshly painted, the iron gates opened wide. A brass plaque by the entrance gleamed in the sunlight, the Grace Rowe Foundation. The air was thick with lavender and the scent of new wood and drying paint. I stood beneath the porch where years ago anger had echoed louder than reason. Now there was only laughter, the rustle of leaves, and the hum of cameras. Local reporters had come along with a few neighbors. Lisa was there too, the journalist with the quiet smile and patient eyes. She carried her camera but approached with the gentleness of someone entering sacred ground. She asked if we could sit for a short interview. We found a spot on the stone steps, the same place where Grace used to read in the afternoons. The air shimmered with the warmth of dusk. Lisa adjusted the lens and asked if Mrs. Rowe were here today. What do you think she'd say about all of this? I looked up. The light was hitting the house just right, the brass plaque glowing like it was alive. A breeze moved through the lavender beds, carrying the scent across the yard. I smiled. She'd probably say that everything finally found its way home. Lisa didn't speak. She turned off the camera, then sat with me in silence. After a while, she said softly, "Sometimes it's the simple stories that make people believe in good again." I didn't answer. I just listened to the sound of children laughing somewhere near the garden. Jacob was there running through the yard with the other kids from the foundation, families, his laughter rising above the soft music and the voices of evening. When the crowd left and the lights began to dim, I stayed behind. The porch light cast a warm circle across the stone walkway. Ethan and Melissa came to say goodnight, promising to return in the morning to plan workshops for the new residents. I shook their hands and watched them disappear through the gate. The night breeze was cool, carrying the sweet weight of summer and lavender. I wandered through the garden, stopping by the flower beds, where new lavender had begun to bloom. I reached down and touched one delicate blossom. Its softness reminded me of Grace's hand on mine that last autumn evening, her touch warm, certain fleeting. When I turned back toward the porch, Jacob came running, holding a photograph still smelling of fresh ink. "Grandpa," he said, his eyes bright, "I want you to keep this." In the picture, we stood together in front of the foundation sign, Ethan, Melissa, Jacob, and me. Behind us, the house glowed with golden light, and the trees framed everything like a memory that refused to fade. "It's beautiful," I said quietly. "Thank you, Jacob." He grinned and ran off again, the sound of his feet soft on the stones, like echoes of a future I finally believed in. I held the photo under the porch light. The image shimmered, catching the glow in a way that made it feel alive. I slipped it into my wallet next to Grace's old note, the one that read, "A house isn't made of brick and wood. It's made of the places where hearts learn to forgive." The night deepened, but the house didn't grow dark. Warm light spilled from every window, painting the trees, the garden, the sky. I sat on the steps, listening to the quiet hum of the world, to the faint sound of a car passing somewhere down the road. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man standing outside his own gate. The house no longer belonged to me, but somehow I belonged to it. I looked up at the shining plaque, the name Grace Rowe gleaming under the moonlight. The wind moved gently through the lavender, carrying its scent through the yard, soft, steady, forgiving. And somewhere between that scent and the glow of the lights, I felt her again. Grace. Smiling. Because finally, after all the years and all the noise, her house had become what it was always meant to be, a place where love comes home. Night fell over Denver like a thin blanket, soft and cool, settling across the rooftops. The stars were faint, almost lost among the city's amber lights. I sat behind the wheel of the restored Ford F-150, the polished hood reflecting the passing glow of the street lamps, like slow-moving rivers of gold. When I turned the key, the engine started smoothly, its sound deep, warm, steady. No more of the uneven stutter that used to echo through long nights when I slept inside this cab with the cold pressing against the glass. My hand rested on the steering wheel, tracing the newly stitched leather seams. Every thread felt deliberate, as if each one tethered me more firmly to the present, not the past. The garage door lifted with a rumble. A rush of night air swept in cool, metallic clean. I pulled out slowly, the faint smell of oil fading behind me. On the dashboard, a small photo of Grace sat in a clipped frame. Her eyes in that picture still seemed to follow me wherever I went. Spear Boulevard stretched open ahead, the dark surface mirroring the bridge lights strung above the South Platte River. I turned on the radio. Static flickered before settling on a familiar station. Lisa's voice came through, steady, low, and clear, reading from the closing lines of her feature. She spoke about fathers who didn't need to win in court, only to believe that truth, when spoken quietly, still held value. She spoke about an old truck that once kept a man warm through the hardest nights, and how that same truck had found its way back onto the road again. As her voice filled the cab, I slowed near Colfax Avenue. Neon spilled from shop windows, colors splintering across the windshield, like tiny shards of stained glass. My fingers brushed against Grace's photo. I whispered to her in my mind, "This road isn't as long as it used to be. Once I thought I'd lost everything: home, family, the name Rowe itself. But to find your way back home, you have to drive straight through the cold you fear most. Keep the engine running until dawn. At a red light, I stopped. On the corner stood a veteran wearing a wool cap, clutching a worn canvas bag. I rolled down the window and called out to him, handing him a small card with the foundation's address. He took it with both hands, eyes bright beneath the lamplight. I told him to come by in the morning. There would be a warm bed breakfast, and people who could teach him how to hold a wrench again without hurting his back. A place where the garage lights came on before sunrise and dimmed only after dusk. He nodded, thanked me, his voice raspy but strong. The light turned green. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of him standing beneath a billboard's glow, one small figure against the wide canvas of the city, like a brushstroke the night had just added. I turned onto the road toward Cherry Hills. Ahead, the brass sign gleamed in the headlights, the Grace Rowe Foundation. The gates stood open. Fresh potted plants lined the entry, the faint scent of paint still hanging in the air. Through the windows, light spilled across the yard. A few volunteers were sorting donations, their laughter drifting through the night. On the radio, Lisa's voice returned softer now, rounding out the broadcast. She spoke about the weekend restoration classes, how the students cheered when the F-150's engine first came back to life. She told a story of a boy who asked why an old truck could still run so well, and how the answer was simple because someone believed it was worth fixing. I smiled quietly, turning down the volume. Let the sound of the engine carry the rest. Wind slipped through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the seat beside me. I thought of Jacob and the photograph he'd given me weeks ago, the one of all of us standing in front of the foundation sign. Ethan on the left, leaning slightly toward me. Melissa's hand wrapped around Jacob's, and me in the center resting a hand on the boy's back. A simple picture. No perfection, no staging. Yet every time I opened my wallet, it seemed to shine. I'd tucked it beside Grace's old note. 2 pieces of paper. 1 message, 1 answer. The roads grew quieter as I left the neighborhoods behind. I merged onto the highway, easing the truck up to speed. The tachometer held steady. The engine hummed low and patient like breath. I thought of Ethan. He'd been coming to the garage lately, twice this week already. He didn't say much. Just stood beside the workbench, helped one of the kids loosen a stubborn bolt, his hands dark with grease. When he left, he'd nod, quiet, certain. It was enough. The road curved along the river. 6 months ago, this stretch was frozen solid, the air so cold my breath would frost against the windshield. Now the South Platte lay flat and silver, the moon stretched thin across its surface like a soft thread of light. I thought about all the people sleeping in cars tonight across Denver, across the country. People who carried their lives in back seats and glove compartments, who kept their keys not for doors, but for dignity. I wished someone would hand each of them a small card or whisper a few words. Come by tomorrow. We'll check the filter. We'll fix the plug. We'll reset the belt. We'll start the engine again. When I turned back toward the garage, the building appeared ahead, its upper window still lit. I always left that lamp burning a soft amber beacon in the dark. I parked the truck, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment, listening to the cooling metal tick in the quiet. The sky felt closer here, the night air clean and light. I opened the glove box, pulled out Grace's photo, and placed it neatly on the dashboard. In my head, I spoke to her, I've done my best. The balance is right again. The truck carries the name and it runs. For a long moment, I just breathed. Then I looked out through the windshield at the city lights glimmering in the distance, each one a heartbeat still pulsing against the dark. If this story makes you think about forgiveness, share it. Click like, subscribe, and send it to someone you believe needs to hear it tonight. Because somewhere out there, someone is still sleeping in their truck, waiting for a single letter, just one to change everything.